Okay, on the air now. So I'm going to try and do this in some sort of a structured way, but I'm not going to make a huge effort. I'm going to let it sort of flow, let it sort of take its own course. So first thing I want to look at is a couple of quotes from the basic premise here is that Islam is a fraud, and I just want to explore how much information we have that can validate that statement. So what we have is, the first question I'm asking is, does free will exist in Islam? These are some of and I think the answer is clearly no. And here's some of the quotes from the Quran and some other sources that are authorities within Islam. So the first one is Quran 390. But those who reject faith after they have accepted it and then go on adding to their defiance of faith, never will their repentance be accepted, for they are those who have of set purpose gone astray. So you can see there that what the Quran, which is supposedly the word of God, according to Islam, it's saying that if you leave the faith, you're basically an outcast. But it doesn't sort of get into any significant measure of punishment. Not yet. So let's look at the next one, Quran 9:66. Make ye no excuses, ye have rejected faith after ye had accepted it. So that's a person that's come into the faith and then they've decided to reject it. So you're an outsider, you become a Muslim, and then you've made this decision to walk away. If we pardon some of you, so we being Allah, we will punish others amongst you for that they are in sin. So it's sort of, I guess it must be saying that, like if you had family or friends, they might suffer consequences on your behalf for you leaving the faith. He who disbelieves in Allah after his having believed, not he who is compelled while his heart is at rest on account of faith, but he who opens his breast to disbelief, on these is the wrath of Allah. So now God's angry. He's not happy. So there's this fear of, particularly if you're a believer in these sky gods, there's this threat that you'll suffer his wrath. So these are probably strong deterrents from leaving the faith. Let's look at some of the more, now these are, I don't know whether they're hadiths or whatever, but they come from Sahih al-Bukhari 9:83-17. And here's where things get a little, so these aren't God's words, these are probably words put together by men. Things get a bit nastier. Allah's apostle said, the blood of a Muslim who confesses that none has the right to be worshipped but Allah, and that I am his apostle, cannot be shed except in three cases. In qisas, I'm not sure what that means, for murder, a married person who commits illegal sexual intercourse, and the one who reverts from Islam, apostate, and leaves the Muslim. So here now the threat on the Muslim's head if they were to leave Islam is death. And that comes from Sahih al-Bukhari 9:83-17. Next one. Ali burnt some people, and this news reached Ibn, son of Abbas, who said, had I been in his place, I would not have burnt them. As the Prophet said, don't punish anybody with Allah's punishment. No doubt, and this is this son of Abbas speaking, I would have killed them for the Prophet said, if somebody, a Muslim, discards his religion, kill him. So again, you know, there's this threat of murder on the head of people that leave Islam. The final one, a man embraced Islam and then reverted back to Judaism. Muaddi bin Jabal came and saw the man with Abu Musa. Muad'Din asked, "What is wrong with this man?" Abu Musa replied, "He embraced Islam and then reverted back to Judaism." But Muad'Din said, "I will not sit down unless you kill him, as it is the verdict of Allah and his apostle." That's Sahih al-Bukhari 9:89:271. So that comes from the authorities within Islam, and this is what lies over the head of a Muslim. So basically, once you become a Muslim, you can only leave through the threat of death. Now, I'm sure that if there's any Muslims there would like to talk about that and educate me on it, I'd like to hear it. You might come up with some sort of excuses, but I think that's the question I've got, I guess, at this point is, all right, so now we've got to imagine that there is a God. I'm very confident that there's not, but we need to just imagine, if we can, for a minute, that there is a God. The question is, why does he want people to die if they don't belong to a group of other people? It just doesn't sort of make sense. You would have thought that if you're not on the right path, then you'll suffer the consequences in your own good time. But why does murder have to come into the play? Well, I think that's a good segue into what I think, and I'll try and demonstrate, I'll try and prove what I think Islam is. All through history, there's been many instances of what's known as cults of personality. And they all have very similar MOs, if you like. A cult of personality is something that's inspired by leaders within a community, and they create an individual, and that individual is then related to a god, mythical or otherwise. I think in all cases, mythical. And there's a modern example of cult of personality, and that's the North Korean situation, where the Kims, using propaganda, which is part of it, part of the MO, they use propaganda to convince, I guess, maybe it was convincing the threat, who knows. The North Korean people would have to tell us that, but they convince people that they are gods, that they can read minds. And it left people in a situation where they were too afraid to actually think wrong thoughts, for fear of consequences. There's a great little video online, a young North Korean girl that escaped from that regime. But anyway, so we have a modern situation where a group of men have got together, cooked up a story, related themselves to gods, and have used that for power. Now, they're not the only ones. I mean, there's plenty of examples all through history. The Romans did it, the Greeks with Zeus. Who else have we got? I might just go out and check my notes. But certainly there's plenty of examples where an individual, I think the Romans did it with Jesus, the Jesus Christ story. But don't get me wrong there, my research revealed that Jesus is a real person. But the Romans ran a cult of personality around a mythical Jesus. And that's what Islam's the same. They've taken Muhammad and made up a mythical relationship through Angel Gabriel, which is something I'm going to talk about today. I've got to give all the evidence that I've got thus far that shows that Angel Gabriel is a fabrication. I think that's one of the key things that will be one of the stumbling blocks or reasons why Islam will fail. And I think it'll fail pretty quickly, because when you start to get into this information and you have a decent sort of MO, it all sort of makes a heck of a lot of sense. So the MO is a cult of personality. So let me just get some information on that, and then probably I'll go from there into the book of Daniel and try and demonstrate clearly how that is a fabrication of prophecy. And it's in that book that the angel Gabriel is first introduced into the religious story. And you can't have a fabricated book being then a valid basis for angels existing. They don't anyway, but you've got to find the true story and try and convince people of the facts so that we can get back into a sane world, semi-sane. Now, where are we? Cult. Okay, so cults of personality. So I mentioned the Kim dynasty in North Korea, a very current, so if anyone was to say to me, hang on, it's not possible to fool, large populations, that's just not realistic. Well, the Kims in North Korea are a prime modern example of how that can happen. Through history, so I'm just reading from this article online. Through history, monarchs and other heads of state were almost always held in enormous reverence. Through the principle of the divine right of kings, for example, rulers were said to hold office by the will of God. So you can see, in some of the areas that this happened, we had it occur in ancient Egypt, Japan, the Incas, the Aztecs, Tibet, Siam, the Roman Empire. So it's not an isolated incident. So all through history, you've got this common event occurring where these leaders were using religion, I guess, for want of a better word, and using it for politics. And in all cases, except for the existing religions that exist today, those cults have sort of passed with time. So their basis is not founded in reality. So it just sort of whittles away. I mean, we no longer worship Jupiter like the Romans did, or Zeus, like the Greeks did. Those things pass. And what I'm suggesting is that Allah is just another phenomenon along those lines, as is Yahweh and Elohim from the Christian tradition. So, where do we go from here? I think what I'd like to do, because I think one of the weakest links in the chain of these of this propaganda is the Book of Daniel. So I want to talk about that a bit. I know a little bit about that. Now, with the Book of Daniel, if you go online and do a search for it's Yale University, I'll see if I can get the URL. Right, it's lecture 4, Judaism in the 1st century. And it's by Dr. Is he a doctor or a professor? Dale Martin's his name. Lecture 4, Judaism in the 1st century. If you look that up and watch that video, he'll give you a lot of detail on he'll give you a lot of detail on the prophecies and how they align perfectly to events that had occurred up to, but not exceeding, 160 BC. Every single prophecy can be explained in terms of events that had occurred up to, but not exceeding 160 BC. That's just a simple fact. Things like the 10 horns, 10 horns of the 4th beast, that can be mapped back to the 10 kingdoms that Alexander the Great conquered. And then it became 4, and everything maps across perfectly. So if you talk to some Christian folk, they'll want you to believe that the events are still current and they're to do with Rome and they're part of an ongoing prophecy. And that's just simply not true. The facts are very, very evident that the prophecies end with the finishing of the Maccabean revolt, 160 BC. Even the days references in there, from Christians you'll get some really weird sort of calculations, but that there's a reference in there for 2,300 days. It specifically adds up to 6.3 years. The battle, the Maccabean revolt, started in December of 167 BC, and it finished sometime early in 160 BC. So there's your 6.3 years. And it also, there's another reference in there, I think it's 1,290 days. If you do the calculation on that, that's 3.5 years. And that's the point in time when a guy called Antiochus or Antiochus Epiphanes becomes ill and then later dies. So all the stories map just perfectly to the history of that particular era. So what's going on? Well, we turn our attention now to looking at the dating of the Book of Daniel. When was it? When was it actually written? Now, the Yale professor will give you a date of 164 BC, based on his deciphering of the Book of Daniel. I don't think he's correct. I think it's sometime between 160 BC and 160 and 150 BC. And I'll explain why. There's a passage in the Book of Daniel that uses, it's called the 77s. and it uses a counting system, or a calendar counting system, that's called Jubilees. We first hear of that in, what's the name of the book where this comes from? Leviticus. Leviticus is the first mention of Jubilees. And what a Jubilee is, in the original telling of Jubilee, it's 7 by 7 years, that is 49 years, plus one Jubilee year, a 50th year. So if I was to express 100 years, and the reason they do it is it's so that you can express long periods of time a little bit more easily. But anyway, this Jubilees. So if I was to say 100 years to you, I would say to you it's 2 Jubilees. But an interesting thing happened around 160 to 150 BC. There's a book of Jubilees which is written. It's marked later on by the heads of the church, so men, as apocrypha, meaning that it's not divinely inspired. But it's, I think that might be a bit of a cover up. But it goes on about a Jubilee, and the way it presents a Jubilee is 7 lots of 7 years. So 1 Jubilee equals 7 times 7, 49 years. And we know that for sure, that's the interpretation of that level. So they missed the 50th year. They completely missed using that. So 7 and 49. And we know that's for sure because if you go into the Book of Jubilees, you'll see that when they use this calendar counting system, it's perfect 49 year blocks. So there's a discrepancy between Leviticus, which says a Jubilee is 50 years, and the Book of Jubilees, which is written around the time the Book of Daniel occurs. It uses, so to express the 100, it's 2 Jubilees, which is 98, plus 2 years, because whoever wrote that book forgot about the 50th Jubilee year, which is, the fallow, it's like the free year or the break year or whatever. So what we have, and sorry, when you go back to the book of Daniel, the counting system that they use in that book is the 49-year one, which to me says very strongly that the person that was the author of the book of Daniel was aware of the book of Jubilees and took that view in terms of expressing time. And if that was so, then it puts it at a date of 150 BC, or sorry, 160 to 150 BC. Now we know that the book of Daniel wasn't apparent in the Hebrew Bible at 200 BC. We know that. Any scholar will tell you that. We also know that there was another book written around 180 BC, and it gave no mention of the book of Daniel. Scholars like the professor from Yale will tell you 64 BC, 164 BC. But I think the more realistic answer is 160. So what's that leave us with? What we've got is we've got this situation where someone has written a book called the Book of Daniel. They've written it after the series of events that it's prophesied. So that's a pure fabrication of prophecy. No prophecy in real terms occurred at all. What they were doing is they took what they knew about real world events and they wrote the book in such a way that it was alleged that a guy called Daniel, 500 years foresaw these things. Nonsense. It's not true. Not true at all. Now, why does that matter to Islam? Well, the book of Daniel is the book that gives us Angel Gabriel. So how can a book that's forging prophecy be then given any merit as a book telling any religious truth? It's just not possible. Can't happen. So what the authors of this book did, they invented Angel Gabriel as part of the story. And that's a major problem for Islam, because it's not the only one. There are a number of other issues that Islam will struggle to answer, but this one's a big one, because it means that Muhammad, or whomever is writing the Quran story, is actually lying. There is no such thing as an angel Gabriel. It was a fabrication from the book of Daniel. So it must follow that whoever told the story, whether it was Muhammad himself or someone writing the story, the Quran, whoever told that story is telling a massive lie, because you can say beyond reasonable doubt that the book of Daniel was a fabrication. The prophecies had already occurred. The author had written after those events. So there's no way, and it's the only time, this is the first time we ever hear of Angel Gabriel. It follows that it has to be a fabrication. It just has to. There's no other explanation other than fanciful thinking from religious folks. Now, what will I do now? Might talk about, just to wrap this up, I might talk about a story about clay birds and Jesus. In the Quran, there's a story about, I might try and copy the text in the chat window, but there's a story about Jesus fashioning some clay into a bird, and then upon doing that, he then blows life into that clay bird, and what we get on the other side is a real live bird. So this is reported in the Quran. I won't bother chasing it down there, but it's definitely in there. So in the Quran, they're recognizing, they're recognizing this Jesus clay bird miracle. There's a problem though with that. If you go back over to the Christian side, you find that must have religious folks popping in there. If you go back to it's called the infancy gospel of Thomas. It's not the gospel of Thomas. There's a whole story to be told about the gospel of Thomas, but the infancy gospel of Thomas tells this story about clay birds and Jesus. And in its story, it talks about 12 clay birds that he gives life to by breathing into them. But on the Christian side, they actually marked it as apocrypha, this infancy gospel of Thomas, not to be confused with the gospel of Thomas. It's marked as apocrypha. So from a Christian's perspective, it's not divinely inspired. Their stance would be that it probably didn't happen. So it's really intriguing that we see the story appear in the Quran about these clay birds. Now, I could get into lots of other things, but I'm going to do this over time. That'll do for today. I'm just going to call it quits, viewer, for today. Got a lot of more stuff to go through, you know, about science and the Quran and all the rest of it. I'll leave that for another day. Thanks for dropping by.